After a 2-year hiatus, Google DeepMind is back with its hit podcast called Google DeepMind, the podcast. And this was previously hosted by Professor Hannah Fry and still is. The previous 2 seasons of the podcast covered a very wide range of fundamental topics in AI, including, looking behind the scenes at the technology that actually powers the tools and models and how it's being used to better business and society. Well, now the podcast is back. They're regularly releasing new episodes, including an initial episode where Fry interviews Google DeepMind CEO Demis Hassabis. And Paul, I know you've been following this series for a while. I think interestingly, this is the first season of the podcast to launch since the debut of ChatGPT nearly 2 years ago. Like, what's important to know about this effort, this show, and this latest season, in your opinion?
First, Hannah Fry, the host, is amazing. So she has a book called Hello World, Being Human in the Age of Algorithms, which I would recommend to everyone. I think that came out around 2021, 2022. I read it a while ago. But she's a brilliant author, professor, mathematician, and she does an incredible job with the interviews. I would suggest listening to the first 2 seasons. I think they're each about 7 or 8 episodes. And so you can binge them, and they're fantastic. You just learn a ton about the inner workings of DeepMind. But season 3 started off with an interview with Demis, and you can go back to season 2, and it's fascinating to sort of benchmark where he thought AI was in season
Mm.
2, a couple of years ago, and where we think we are today. So I would start off with Demis Hassabis. So we talk about Demis a lot on this show. If you're a regular listener to the show, it's a name familiar to you. But having done hundreds of keynotes in the last few years on AI, and in almost every one of them using Demis's definition of AI, and then asking how many people in the room are familiar with Demis Hassabis,
Mm.
it is rare in a room of hundreds of people to get more than one or two hands to go up.
Yeah. Wow.
So Demis is extremely well known within the AI world, certainly within technology. But when you get outside into the business world, into the marketing world, it's just not a name people know. And I think it should be. So what I'll often say is I'll use his definition. So the definition Demis gives of AI, and this goes back to like a Rolling Stone article in like 2016, 17 is when I first saw it. AI is the science of making machines smart. And I always love that definition because of its simplicity. And what I tell people is like replace machines with software, and it actually makes a ton of sense that the software we use to do our jobs, whether it's marketing or HR or finance or legal or whatever it is, the software you use is getting smarter. It's developing the ability to think, to create, to understand, to reason, to plan. And software before didn't do those things. So I like to use his definition because I think it's extremely approachable and it makes sense to a lot of people. And then I'll often say, like, Demis is going to be one of the most important people of our generation, if not all of human history. And then when you start to talk about the work he has done, like with AlphaGo and AlphaFold, and just everything they're doing at DeepMind, it's really important people understand who Demis is and follow along. So he was a child chess prodigy. He's 48, I believe. I think he was 1976 he was born. Chess prodigy, a renowned video game designer, developer by the age of 17, co-founded DeepMind in 2010, PhD in cognitive neuroscience with a focus on imagination and memory. So like he's really focused on understanding the human mind, but then
Mm.
a lot of their research was through gameplay. And so early it was Atari games and then into the game of Go. And so their team, after they were acquired in 2014 by Google, their team built AlphaGo that defeated the world champion in Lee Sedol in 2016. AlphaFold predicts the structure of nearly all known proteins. They open source that research. They just recently came out with AlphaFold 3 that'll accelerate like drug discovery, for example. So they do incredible work. So anytime Demis does a podcast, I listen to it. I think I've listened to basically every podcast he's ever done. So I think everyone should go listen to the episode. I'm just going to highlight maybe like 5 or 6 key topics that were discussed, but it's worth going and listening to the full thing. So the title of the podcast episode, if I'm not mistaken, is something like "Unreasonably Effective,"
Mhm.
and that starts out early in the episode where they talk about large language models being unreasonably effective, which is how Demis described them. So when Professor Fry asked about that, he said somehow these systems, if you give them enough data, they do seem to learn and generalize from examples, not just rote memorization, but actually somewhat understand what they're processing. And it's sort of a little bit unreasonably effective in the sense that I don't think anyone would have thought it would work as well as it has, say, 5 years ago. So for me, like that's a really interesting one because again, he is at the forefront and he's saying 5 years ago, we wouldn't have guessed these models would be doing what they're doing.
Mm,
And so what we're always trying to do on the show is like capture the moment, like where are we and where do we think we're going to go? But I think that excerpt is representative of the fact that even the people in the at the leading edge of this aren't really clear. And I remember like in Genius Makers by Cade Metz, one of my favorite books on AI, he told the story of when DeepMind achieved defeating the world champion of Go, that there were other labs working on it. And I think at the time, even like Jan LeCun at Meta thought they were crazy, that it wasn't something that would be achievable in the near term. And then like 6 months later, they announced that they had done it. So you can't ever feel like any one AI expert knows what's going to happen because they don't agree on this stuff. And oftentimes they underestimate or overestimate what's going to happen. The other one I wanted to touch on is underhyped versus overhyped. So she asked, do you think that where we are right now, how things are at this moment, is overhyped or underhyped? Or is it just hype perhaps in the wrong direction? To which Demis responded, yeah, I think it's more the latter. So I would say that in the near term, it's hyped too much. I think people are claiming it can do all sorts of things it can't. There's all sorts of startups and VC money chasing crazy ideas that are just not ready. On the other hand, I think it's still underhyped. I think it's underhyped or perhaps underappreciated even now what's going to happen when we get to AGI and post AGI.
yes.
Now keep in mind here, he's not saying if that he believes it is a when, as does Sam Altman, as does many of the others. So I still don't feel like people have quite understood how enormous that's going to be and therefore the responsibility of that. So it's both really, I think it's a little bit overhyped in the near term and at the moment. Um, Another one I liked was she asked about, well, how do you evaluate all these AI startups? Like, how do you know what's real? And this is
Mm,
something, Mike, you and I talk to, companies about a lot, where it's
yeah.
like, how do we trust these vendors? And so he said, I think you need to look at obviously the technical due diligence, have some understanding of the technology and the latest sort of trends. I think also look at perhaps the background of the people. How technical are they? Have they just arrived in AI like last year from somewhere else? I don't know. Were they doing crypto last year? These might be clues that perhaps they're jumping on the bandwagon. And it doesn't mean to say they can't come up with good ideas like this. But it's more like lottery ticket, shall we say, meaning they might get lucky and switch from crypto to this, but they needed to been there for a while. She did ask him about Gemini and how it's different from other models. He basically talked about how they've built it multimodal from the ground up, so it has a better understanding of the world around it. And again, multimodal being not just text input, but image and video and audio and code. And then he also talked about their big innovation in memory, which they were the first to market with the million context, and now it's 2 million. And they've talked about 10 million context being how much content you can give it. So, whether it's videos or books or whatever it may be. And then he did say he basically felt like it was Gemini, ChatGPT, and Anthropic Claude are the three main models to, pay attention to. And he said the other ones like Meta and Mistral are doing interesting things, but it's pretty much a three-horse race at this point.
mm,
She did ask him about open source. So we talk a lot about that. We'll talk about SB 1047 again later in this episode. And he said they're huge proponents of it. Like they've been big believers of it. They've open sourced AlphaFold, their AlphaGo research. But he did say it's okay to do it now because the systems aren't that powerful. Quote, but in 2, 3, 4 years' time, especially when you start getting agent like systems and agentic behaviors, then if something's misused by someone or perhaps even a rogue nation, that could cause serious harm. So then I think I don't have a solution for that, but as a community we need to think about what does that mean for open source. And then this is what he proposed. Perhaps the frontier models need to have more checks on them, and then only after they've been out for a year or two, then they can be open sourced. And he did say that's basically what they're doing with their Gemma model. So Gemma is their open source model. And he pretty much said, like, we're giving you a year or two old technology. We're giving you the smaller version that's basically like a year old. It's not our frontier model. and the
Mhm.
frontier models, we need to have a bigger focus. And then two other thoughts here. So he talked about the role of planning and agents. So this is a recurring topic for us. So he said they still can't do actions in the world for you. They're very much like passive Q&A systems. I think that agentic is the next era. These sort of more agent-based systems, we would call them, have these agent-like behaviors where they can do things for you. And then he said, and this is where my biggest argument is why I think in the end Google still has the advantage. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously OpenAI is doing insane stuff, Anthropic's doing insane stuff, but I always go back to AlphaGo as the thing that no one else has nor has built. And so he says, this agent area is what we're expert in. That's what we use to build with all of our game agents, including AlphaGo and all the other things we've talked about in the past. So a lot of what we're doing is bringing, marrying that work together. So the large language models with their reinforcement learning systems like AlphaGo. So the next generation of systems you think of as combining AlphaGo with Gemini. So I'm going to say one other part. I'm going to, Mike, actually read an excerpt from our book from
Yeah.
2022 because I think this sets the stage for the significance of AlphaGo, but it also is a prelude to some of the other things we're going to talk about a little later in this episode. So in our book, we kind of talked about this move 37, this famous move that happened during the 2016 match with Lee Sedol. And then we talked about the relation of that move and what this AlphaGo system was able to do, and the impact it may have on creativity and planning and knowledge work. So I'm just going to read this quick excerpt from our book. So it says, this debate over machine creativity was brought to life in game two of the AlphaGo versus Go world champion Lee Sedol match in 2016. Move 37, as it became known, saw the DeepMind machine place a stone on the Go board in a non traditional spot that had human Go experts baffled. Michael Redman, a commenter on the live English broadcast and a top Go player himself, said at the time, quote, I wasn't expecting that. I don't really know if it's good or bad. It's a very strange move. Sedol, who had already lost game one to the machine, was in disbelief. He stared at the board for a moment, sat back in his chair, and spent the next 12 minutes assessing his options before finally making his next move. Sedol never recovered. He would lose game two, and AlphaGo would go on to win the best of five series 4-1. The DeepMind team had trained AlphaGo, and this is the real important stuff here. The DeepMind team had trained AlphaGo using deep learning, specifically a type called reinforcement learning, in which AlphaGo learned to discover new strategies by playing millions of games of Go against versions of itself. In addition, AlphaGo learned the ancient game of Go by studying millions of moves made by top human Go players. Cade Metz, who I mentioned earlier, an author and technology correspondent with the New York Times, was in Seoul, South Korea, covering the match for Wired magazine. He spoke with DeepMind's David Silver, the lead researcher on the AlphaGo project, about Move 37. Metz summarized what happened in this way. Now, as I'm reading this, think about the future of these models and their ability to learn and to plan and to reason. So AlphaGo learns from human moves, and then it learns from moves made when it plays itself. It understands how humans play, but it can also look beyond how humans play to an entirely different level of the game. This is what happened with Move 37. AlphaGo had calculated that there was a 1 in 10,000 chance that a human would make that move. But when it drew on all the knowledge it had accumulated by playing itself so many times and looked ahead to the future of the game, it decided to make the move anyway. And the move was genius. In AlphaGo the movie, which everyone should watch, it's free on YouTube, Silver said of Move 37 that AlphaGo went, quote, went beyond its human guide and it came up with something new and creative and different. But in the documentary, Silver also made the point that this is not human versus machine, rather human plus machine. Quote, AlphaGo is human created, and I think that's the ultimate sign of human ingenuity and cleverness. Everything that AlphaGo does, it does because a human has either created the data that it learns from, created the learning algorithm that learns from that data, or created the data that it learns from, or created the data that it learns from, created the learning algorithm that learns from the data, or hold on a second. I think I pasted that one in there twice. Basically learns from the data or created the data that it learns from. All these things have come from humans. So really, this is a human endeavor. And then in the final excerpt here, Seidel would later say, I thought AlphaGo was based on probability calculation and that it was merely a machine. But when I saw this move, I changed my mind. Surely AlphaGo is creative. This move was really creative and beautiful. So in a later topic, rapid fire, we're going to talk about this idea of can large language models create new ideas and innovate? And I want you to remember this excerpt when we get into that conversation.
Yeah, and just to reiterate, that's why we are covering this and why it's so important, as we say so often, to follow these leading voices in AI. I mean, there's relatively few people like Demis driving this type of innovation, and he's been here since the beginning. So hearing what he has to say is not just an exercise in listening to someone making, a public or PR appearance, but you can really get clues to what the future holds, it sounds like.
Yeah, and again, it's one perspective, but for me, Demis has always been sort of the leading perspective. So, while we listen to and comment on all these other AI leaders, I've just always found him to be like the most authentic, and someone who I felt was truly just pursuing knowledge and intelligence and answers. And I don't feel like he's ever there promoting anything. Like I just he's a researcher who became a CEO, but I think at his core, he's still just trying to find answers.